Majority Report with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Monday, February 11th, 2019. My name is Sam Seder. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, the coming of the American Behemoth, the origins of fascism in the United States from 1920 to 1940. May give us some clues about what's going on now. By Michael Joseph Roberto. Also on the program today, another shutdown looms as Democrats insist on capping the number of immigrant prison camps we can have in this country. Meanwhile, in Virginia, Lieutenant Governor Fairfax impeachment now being discussed as Northam digs in. And in Colorado, Denver teachers strike. And they're doing it for the first time in 25 years. Meanwhile, Amazon claims their fifis are hurt and may go somewhere else. Goodbye. Guaido in Venezuela weighing whether to authorize the U.S. intervention. Must be nice.
Yeah, just spitballing.
Hey, maybe I'll authorize it.
Yeah, maybe. Hey, I did declare myself head of state, so obviously I could welcome a foreign intervention anytime I please.
Just an idea.
An idea.
Crowdsourcing ideas.
Just crowdsourcing endogenous ideas.
Klobuchar enters the race amid reports of her abusive behavior to staffers.
But Republicans love her. So Republicans love her and staffers flee from her. Klobuchar 2020.
Ilhan Omar attacked for criticism of Israel. And Steve Schmidt, a little touchy about selling his soul.
A little sensitive.
Meanwhile, the estate tax touches no family farmers, as we know. However, Trump's trade war has pushed twice as many family farms into bankruptcy in 2018. And lastly, Arizona license plates secretly fund anti-LGBTQ groups. That's nice. All that and more on today's program. Not all of those license plates, just, of course, the ones that say, "In God We Trust." We'll talk about that later. But why wouldn't they? That's just the price you pay for religion, folks. That's just the price you pay.
Gotta have God.
Gotta have a lot of God. We will get to the shutdown. I mean, on some level, there's not a lot more that we can say about this situation other than that's where it stands now. I imagine Republicans are very concerned about this, and I hope that labor unions of folks who work in the U.S. government, or I should say are impacted in any way by the U.S. government shutdown. So that includes, the flight attendants who don't work for the government but rely on federal air traffic controllers and TSA folks to keep them safe when they fly. Remember, I mean, if you're flying as much as they do, you don't want there to be any even minor, never mind appreciable reduction in the amount of flight safety. And so hopefully, in the event that there is a shutdown, and we will know, obviously, by Friday, end of day Friday, these folks are not going to wait around a month. They're just going to say, we're done with this. We know where this goes. We're there. So we shall see. Meanwhile, don't like to usually talk about the behind the scenes at other podcasts because, who cares? Although this is an interesting story. As you know, we've been talking about Steve Schmidt a little bit lately because he and his brother-in-arms, Bill Burton, both. What's the name of that god with the money? What's the Mammoth? No, who is it? Who do you sit to? You bow down to?
Lakshmi?
No, I don't know.
What are you thinking? Hindu god? What?
I can't remember.
Moloch?
Yeah, maybe Moloch. No, not Moloch. Is that money? Anyways, these guys.
Steve Schmidt's like, so you're like, these guys don't know the money god.
Don't know the money
losers."
god. Look, I like money.
Mammon.
Mammon. Yeah, there
Mammon.
you go. Mammon.
Oh.
I like money. Money's good. That's great. But I think it would take a tremendous amount of money for me to not just sell out, but to sell out so nakedly and so vividly, right? Like, it's one thing to say, like, yeah, 15 years ago I believed that, but today I don't, so I'm going to take a big chunk of change. It's much tougher to do that when it's like 6 weeks ago I believed something wholeheartedly, and then all of a sudden somebody drove a Brinks trucks up to my house, and I was like, who's going to notice? Well, apparently a lot of people noticed when Steve Schmidt did it. And I don't know exactly how much money Howard Schultz is paying Steve Schmidt, but I imagine there are a lot of zeros at the end of that figure. And that the figure itself may very well be double digits. Maybe it's just a single digit, but I have a feeling that there's at least six zeros after it, right? And apparently he just thought, nobody's going to notice. Certainly not the people who work on the podcast I do every week are going to notice. And so Steve Schmidt has this podcast called Words Matter. Which, of course, is a little ironic because...
That's a Trump dig, right?
Yeah, he said a lot of words, though, about
Words
how...
matter.
In fact, there was a piece in Vanity Fair, I think when they were launching this podcast, and he does it with Elise Jordan, who is, sort of I think she's now a former Republican, and always had sort of moderate leanings. And she's nice. I've met her multiple times. We did a panel with her at Politicon, but also at MSNBC for years. She was married to a journalist who, people may remember, who wrote for Rolling Stone, who ended up dying in a car accident.
And what was his name? I'm totally forgetting his name. He was a really good journalist.
Anyways, I just want to read this before I forget. So back, I guess this was in August, they launched this podcast, Words Matter, as an answer to Pod Save America, which is like, what could be more Pod Save America than Pod Save America? And they said, Words Matter. No, I made that part up. And at the time, Schmidt told Vanity Fair that he thought the conservative movement, and by extension the Republican Party, which he had left 2 months earlier, had become a racket. In other words, people were just taking these political positions for money, right? I mean, that's what we mean when we say a racket, right? It's just a way in which you can make money. It's not legit. It's disingenuous. It's just done for the money. And then, now granted, this was all the way back in August of last year. So that's almost, someone do the math. That's almost 8 months ago, maybe a little bit less.
It's a long time.
But it was 2018, so it's you could also argue it's a different year.
Before the midterms.
And it was before the midterms. which seems like a year ago. And time is dilated. So in many respects, during the Trump era, a human year feels like a dog year in some respects. So he may have forgotten that he was launching his new career based upon, like, we're not about pulling some type of racket. We're not up here just doing this for the money. America is important. And then somebody comes around, a billionaire, and offers him God knows how much cash. But I suspect if it was like in $100 bills, you would not be able to carry it. If it was in $100 denominations,
Steve Schmidt wouldn't be able to carry it.
I don't think anybody. I think you need a truck. I think you would need at least a pickup truck. And I'm talking like an 8-foot bed.
Turns out words aren't the only thing that matter.
Yes. Words, parens, and other things sometimes too matter. But so his podcast is EP'd by a guy who is sort of I think a longtime Democratic operative, but sort of like probably like a moderate Democratic operative. And I think he was the one who set up the podcast. And this guy, Levine, Adam Levine. And so Elise Jordan, Adam Levine, sat down last Tuesday with Steve Schmidt to interview him about Schultz. And apparently there was a lot of screaming and yelling, according to this Newsweek article, or Daily Beast article, before they sat down. Finally, he agreed to sit down and talk about the Schultz thing. But seems like something was eating at him a little bit, and, well, he snaps.
Will this be, if Howard Schultz does decide to enter the race, will he run an issues-driven campaign, and will reducing the deficit continue to be, as he said, his primary focus?
I think the thing that you will most see from him in the conversation that lies ahead is honesty. He's going to have a very honest conversation, a very adult conversation with the American people about all manner of issues that have not been talked about seriously in a long, long, long time. I mean, we have a debate that rages in this country, if you look at all of the issues facing it, that is about a wall on the southern border that is completely unnecessary in a moment of time where there's zero net illegal immigration coming across the southern border.
Steve, you say he wants to have an adult
All right, pause it for 1 second before we get to, just wanted to contemplate the idea of, like, what topics are Howard Schultz going to talk about? Like, I know what Donald Trump is talking about. Right. But what topics of Howard Schultz are going to talk about that are not covered by somebody running for office in the Democratic Party? Right? Like, we have a full range of voices in the Democratic Party. We're going to see more, right? We haven't even begun to see. I think we're at the halfway mark in terms of the number of candidates we're going to see, and they're going to range from, Joe Biden and maybe Bennett on one end of the Democratic Party. We're going to be talking about deficits. Maybe we're going to be talking about, like, we don't want to go crazy with some of this crazy policies.
Careful with the deficit.
But we should attack different nations.
And then people like us saying that we want a childish conversation on Medicare for all.
Then you get the childish, of course, the childish end who are like, well, maybe we should just provide benefits to the American public that they're really excited about and would help their daily lives. So all of that's going to be in there. I don't know what Schultz is talking about. It's almost as if, like, the words he's saying are not true, that they're like just spin. But then his co-host, or his executive producer, is not his host, but is for today, says, well, let's talk about childish.
Steve, you say he wants to have an adult conversation. Last week, he called a 70% tax on incomes over $10 million ridiculous from a United States congresswoman who happened to have been elected to something. Now, I know you're a guy of words, Steve, and ridiculous means deserving or inviting derision or mockery, absurd, synonyms, comical, hilarious. We could go on. Farcical. Is that what does he really mean, that a tax on incomes over $10 million at 70%? which is widely popular with the American people, is ridiculous? Is that an adult conversation?
Yeah, I think he thinks it's ridiculous and it's confiscatory and that it's anti-growth. That would be his point.
Will Derek Jeter or another athlete not hit another home run because they're going to get taxed at 70? What's the economic behavior that he thinks it's anti-growth other than his own pocket?
Adam, this is bullshit. I'm not doing this.
Steve, you got to answer the questions.
I'm not.
You got to, Steve.
I'm not.
Unfortunately, the interview ended there. We wanted to ask Steve some serious and important questions about his new role.
Yeah.
Fuck you, Steve. We hate you back.
Well, Steve basically just screwed them over too. Ended the podcast more or less, I guess. Blew it up because he has to go work for Schultz, and that's a full-time job when you are pretending to. I mean,
he took a confiscatory approach to that podcast earnings.
Exactly. He's also a confiscatory approach in terms of some money he's going to take from from Howard Schultz.
Oh yeah, he's got a very confiscatory approach to Howard Schultz's money.
Now let me just say this. I will say this. Okay, in all fairness, Steve Schmidt, he has shown that he has got more comfortable, that there's something, I want to say there's something inherently with being a Republican that makes you run a racket, right? Because as much as he sort of left the Republican Party because it turned into a racket, and the conservative movement because it turned into a racket, he ended up falling back into another one very shortly after that, which incidentally threatens the very thing that he left the Republican Party for, which is to reelect Donald Trump.
I may also just state, this guy gave us Sarah Palin.
And I was going to say, remind you, this is the guy who basically, I don't know if he was the midwife for Donald Trump. He was like the doula for Donald Trump. He just helped in the birthing of Donald Trump by bringing us Sarah Palin. But to be fair, as bad as Steve Schmidt is, Bill Burton may be worse. Because Bill Burton, supposedly, not only supposedly came from a better pedigree in terms of his politics, right? But he got his old firm to try and tell Democrats to lay off Starbucks because Starbucks was taking grief because of Howard Schultz.
I think we're going to need to really think about this, guys. Because I got an opportunity to make a stupid amount of money.
Yeah, listen. So that doesn't trump everything, but it should trump most things. And so can we just lay off Starbucks, please?
I think we're going to need to risk having a bigger imagination about the Starbucks brand.
Sort of feel like you guys are inhibiting your risking of a brave new imagination about the things I could buy.
But Bill Burton would have been better on that pod, though. He would have sat there and he would have just been like, I'm really glad you asked that.
Right.
I have some total nonsense.
Right. That's a great question.
Oh, that's an awesome question. Wish we could go longer.
Now, what's going to be interesting is how Howard Schultz reacts to this. Because if it was Donald Trump would be very pleased with Steve Schmidt. You told those guys off. You said F you to them. It's going to be interesting to see if Howard Schultz doesn't distance himself from Steve Schmidt now, or if he likes that a la Donald Trump. So I guess that's the question. Howard Schultz, are you Donald Trump? Are you Howard Schultz? Or really, is there a difference?
Decaf Donald Trump.
It's probably the difference between 4% and 5%.
Yeah, that's right.
Decaf Donald.
I'm a real billionaire, says Schultz.
I mean, actual money.
All right.
They were a certain degree of class.
Oh, I already told you guys what happened last time we got a shipment of Sherry's Berries in here. We had a lot of the crew who had traveled to see the Michael Brooks show was here, and thank God. I think Jeff from Georgia had about 4 of those things. But, I begged him to because I can't have, I can have one, but if there's more of them than that, I'll eat all of them. They were delicious. Huge strawberries, dipped in, they had milk, dark chocolate, white chocolate. They're beautiful. Any discerning palate will love these. They're topped with a decadent chocolate chips and heart and glitter sprinkles. I'm having trouble reading this now. Your Valentine will fall in love with every bite. These are the perfect companion to a candlelit dinner, a bouquet of flowers, or a night on the town, and they ship anywhere nationally. They always arrive fresh with a 100% Sherry Berries guarantee. Valentine's Day is just days away, so send your Valentine the gift of their dreams at the price of your dreams, just starting at $19.99 plus shipping and handling. Order now. Make this Valentine's Day really special by adding a dozen red roses for just $19.99. More. Jamie took those home and said they were beautiful. They're shipped with your Sherry's Berries at no extra charge. Just go to berries.com, click on the microphone, enter my code Seder at checkout. So that's berries.com, berries.com. Click the microphone, enter the code Seder, order today. And, oh yeah, this is a big problem in this country. Every 2 seconds, there's a new victim of identity theft, which means a criminal could be spending your money, applying for loans in your name, even damaging your credit. Unfortunately, you can miss certain threats to your identity just by checking bank statements and monitoring your credit. There's all sorts of, look, every day it seems like we're hearing about another massive data leak. Good thing there's LifeLock identity theft protection. LifeLock uses proprietary technology to detect and alert you to a wide range of identity threats, like your social security number for sale on the dark web, for instance. And if you do have an issue involving identity theft, one of LifeLock's identity restoration specialists will work to help you fix it. This is the hardest part about all this. I've heard nightmare stories of people taking years to deal with this stuff. It screws up your ability to get a car loan. It screws up your ability to get a student loan. It screws up your ability to get a mortgage. It screws up your ability to get other credit cards, or when they check you out, maybe even to rent a car. Of course, no one can prevent all identity theft or monitor all transactions at all businesses. But with LifeLock, you get identity theft protection and additional features to help protect your devices against cyber threats for as low as $9.99 a month, I should say. Don't waste another second. Visit lifelock.com/majority now to save 10% on your first year. That's lifelock.com/majority for 10% off. Lifelock.com/majority. Check it out. All right, folks, going to take a quick break. When we come back, Professor Michael Joseph Roberto from the University of North Carolina, North Carolina and T State University, on his book, The Coming of the American Behemoth, The Origins of Fascism in the United States, 1920-1940. Right back. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program Michael Joseph Roberto, a retired faculty member of the North Carolina Agricultural Technical State University, where he taught contemporary world history, longtime political activist in Greensboro, North Carolina, and the author of The Coming of the American Behemoth, The Origins of Fascism in the United States, 1920 to 1940. Welcome to the program, Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Sam, for having me.
Let's start with your definition of fascism, so that we can, make sure that everyone's terms are at least aligned in this context.
Okay. My definition of fascism, first of all, comes from how others defined it, specifically the people who make up the pages of my book, their writings. And they defined fascism more or less I think in a way in which there was a consensus and a discourse that fascism in America represented the power of big business, that fascism was, in fact, big business in power, business as a system of power. In its essence, finance capital itself was fascist. Fascism was defined as the rule of finance capital. And that's pretty much my definition, because many of them were Marxists, and so am I, to the extent that we all followed a basic method in determining who had power, who lacked power, and what the contradictions were, and how fascism came to being in embryonic form in the U.S. in the 1920s, in the 1930s. So my definition of fascism is not an original definition. I see myself in the long line of Marxist analysis, and also people who are inspired by Marxist analysis, but were not themselves socialists. And my book has many examples of individuals like that. So I hope I've answered your question that way. I mean, to this extent, fascism as a function of capitalism is not right now paramount in the discussions that we are having about fascism in the present. And I think that what my book points to is the necessity for having this kind of discussion, so we can broaden out what we mean by fascism in the present. And fascism in the present is what it was in the 30s, even more so. And so my book is about the coming of the American behemoth, and now the behemoth is at full strength.
So, okay, so just, help me, let's just go a little further in terms of, you say the business system and the rule of finance capital. How does this, in the context of the 20s, and then I think maybe people can start to see see it a little bit clearer today in relationship, but how does that in the 20s manifest itself in a at a day-to-day, month-to-month basis?
In America.
In America.
Okay. Well, I guess one way to do that, since the 1920s is a starting point, is to just briefly begin to answer your question by contrasting life in America in the early 20s and life in Italy in the early 20s, specifically in 1922 when Mussolini came to power. And many people, many Americans, have an understanding of fascism first appearing in history in Italy in the 1920s, and then, of course, a decade later with Hitler. Now, going back to the U.S., the U.S. is the epicenter of the capitalist world system after World War I. It is the world's leading creditor nation. It has surpassed Great Britain as the world power, but in a way in which its power is unprecedented as a capitalist empire. The 1920s in the United States is known as a period of great prosperity, the prosperous 20s, the great boom. It's in the 1920s when American capitalism in its monopoly finance form takes greater and greater control over American life, over American society, over its political institutions, and over the life of the individual itself. And it does this primarily in two ways, in two fundamental ways. If we define fascism as the rule of finance capital, and that means that fascism is inherent in American capitalism, then two fundamental processes, two main categories of processes come out of this. One is what we call terrorist processes, and the other are non-terrorist processes. Both seek the same thing, the domination of capital over society. During the Great Boom, when American capitalism is reached unprecedented power, not only in terms of its national economy, but because of its global outreach, it is an empire in the process of becoming one. Life in America is suddenly transformed into a giant boomtown in which production of different kinds of goods is unprecedented, and in this boom, we find the greater and greater power of monopoly, of capitalist enterprise. And it is based on being able to, first of all, pacify labor in 1919 and 1920, where the great challenge of labor to the capitalists is put down, and then the boom begins in 22 and lasts until 29. This boom is based on the need to constantly produce, and it is an explosion of production that is directed toward consumer goods, and of course the capital goods, the goods that are used to make consumer goods itself. So we get this tremendous burst of production and prosperity, and it has to be sustained on the basis of capitalist production and the laws of capitalist accumulation, which I argue in my book and which comes from Marx. This means that at home in the 1920s, the seeds of fascism come at a time of prosperity when there is a growing all kinds of products available, which some people are able to buy, and then more people are able to buy because they borrow to buy it, and so we get installment credit. And here's where the whole non-terrorist aspect of fascism comes into play in a moment of prosperity. You must keep people consuming in order to keep producing, and this relies increasingly on an American population that is promised uninterrupted prosperity, and in 1929 finds out that the process. We discovered that the so-called prosperity was actually only prosperity for a few, and very little changed in terms of material progress for the vast majority of people in this country. So that's the long answer on the 20s. In other words, fascism, we usually think of fascism as terrorism. Well, fascism is terrorism, but it's also, as a function of capital, it's also based on acquisitiveness and the ability to sell and the ability to convince people to keep buying into the system, where where the marketplace becomes a more democratic thing, a place, as many Americans are taught to believe, than the polling place. And these are all fascist processes because they extend the role, they extend the power of capital over all of us.
Okay, so the idea being, if I understand you correctly, because I'm trying to sort of, I think like when people contemplate the idea of fascism, it involves a sort of a one-party dictatorship, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be, obviously, a political party per se. It is fundamentally anti-democratic. It is, in some respect, totalitarian. It involves sort of like a rigid set of, or a rigid set of rules in which one can, function without getting in trouble, essentially, in the context of society. And so your argument is that finance capital, essentially, because they were so dominant in this era, that they were imposing both what you call a terroristic and a non-terroristic fascistic rule in that sense. And and the non-terroristic is almost like a soft is the function. And I'm just trying to, bring folks into, understanding these terms. The non-terroristic is sort of like a soft terrorism, like where, look, you have to, where you start buying into the notion of being coerced on some level, I guess. Right? By material needs and whatnot. And the more terroristic is, hey, you don't pay your bills, we're taking your house, essentially.
That's how the legal arm. That's how legality, or in a state that becomes more and more gangster-like because it departs from constitutional principles. What you have are legalized illegalities. And yes, that's a form of coercion, and I guess it's a form of terror when it comes to the terror that one can inflict on the mind. But let me try to paint this kind of portrait here with respect to our understanding of what we commonly think of as fascism, as the opposite of democracy, as dictatorship, where in the case of Italy and Germany, fascism comes to power as a result of a mass movement. Less so in Italy, because even though it's the first regime, a fascist regime that comes to power, it in many ways is the first and therefore an experimental kind of model. In other words, it has all of the characteristics that make for what we understand to be fascism. But we should try to recognize it as a European manifestation of fascism, in which the driving force was a movement from below. In the case of Mussolini and the fascist people who built a movement very, very quickly, or one big enough to basically convince the various parts of the ruling class in Italy that they were the only bet against socialist revolution. And so what you get out of that is then the rise of a corporate state where there's this phony existence between capital and labor, but of course the whole thing is held together by Mussolini and his ability to basically always promise the capitalists that they're going to get whatever they want. My point here is that what you get is a dictatorial regime in Italy, and then of course you get something even more intense in the same way in Germany, where the forces at work are much greater in magnitude, and the end result is a dictatorship that is unprecedented in world history, from which we get the Holocaust. We get genocide and Holocaust and World War. In the U.S., in the 1920s, again, if we understand that these folks in the 30s and the early 40s who were writing about fascism were really onto something, and we then look at fascism as a world historical phenomenon that is unique to the 20th century and now into the 21st century, then what we see in the U.S. is the actual genesis of fascism as the aim of capitalist dictatorship, which is a reflection of the dictatorship of capital. So in the U.S., during the period of prosperities, during the period of the boom, you get this tightening of capital's control over American society, where labor is more and more chained to capital, and people's fate in so many ways is connected to capital, to capitalist enterprise. And while all this is going on sort of peacefully in the U.S. in the 20s, it's U.S. capitalism that is also primarily behind fascist Italy from the mid-1920s right up until into the early 30s, until Mussolini invaded Ethiopia. So my point is here that if we understand fascism from the standpoint of terrorist and non-terrorist processes, we see all of this developing within the framework of the U.S. empire in the 1920s. And then, as a result of the contradictions within capitalism, which is something we have not talked about here, then the crisis then creates an intensification of both terrorist and non-terrorist forms during the period in the U.S. during the 1930s. I mean, in my book, at the end of chapter 7, you will read about how, in the desperation of Hoover's inability to end the Depression, you got people calling for a Mussolini in this country. What America needs is a Mussolini. When Roosevelt first came into office, he was urged to suspend the Constitution and create a Council of State that would temporarily manage the U.S. and pull it out of the crisis, out of the Depression. So these are all very complex historical questions that my book just begins to introduce to the public. I mean, all I'm trying to do here is bring to our attention this earlier discourse on fascism that was buried by later historians. And the reason why it was buried by later historians is because it demonstrated the absolute connection between fascism and capitalism.
Okay,
and liberal historiography has buried that for decades.
And
attempted to anyway.
Yeah, and I want to talk about to what extent, and I think I don't want to jump ahead here, but I imagine for the most part we've been dealing with that non-terroristic fascism that capitalism has exerted for much of the remaining 20th century after the post-World War era. But before we get there, let me how was it that, and I think I know the answer to this, but I think it's worth exploring. How was it that capital created a greater, and particularly finance capital, created a greater, reliance of the people on finance capital as we entered into the 20s, as opposed to, say, the turn of the century or, the late 1900s?
Well, I'm not an economist, but I would have to say that the reason for finance capital having the control that it has to do with the stages of capitalist development. Once we enter the monopoly stage, and through competition, the monopolies get fewer and bigger in number, they require more and more credit. And so to the extent that I understand of what Marx is saying about in chapter 25 of volume 1 of Capital, the necessity for credit credit becomes necessary for further capitalist accumulation once the monopoly stage is achieved. And again, in the U.S., if the U.S. is the strongest capitalist power, the epicenter of the world system after World War I, and then it becomes an even greater power after World War II, then that means that finance becomes supreme because the whole system runs on the basis of finance. So if I understand your question, correctly, that's the answer that I would give, and this is how, despite the failings or whatever, the Occupy movement in 2011 looked at the source of the problem, the source of all power, of all inequality in America. And despite the problem of the 99%, we know how important it is to see the divisions within the 99% and to see how capitalist oppression and brutality operates on the basis of race and gender and promotes greater inequality. So we see these differentiations, but the power of finance capital has never been greater. And I think the laws that govern the movement of capital in the period of late capitalism, which corresponds to the period of contemporary world history, in other words, a period of 1880s, from the 1880s to the present, the period that Lenin himself said it defines modern imperialism. Imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. We are living out what I think is the end game of capitalism, which is the complete power of finance over all of us, and the extent to which it creates spectacles for us to continue to buy into, of which none of us are immune. I mean, very few of us can say that we're immune from the spectacle and the magical spell of capital over our lives. This is in its essence fascism, because it seeks and has succeeded in taking control of the government. And so what we get now is a ruling class that I think it wants more and more of whatever it can get from most of us, while it seeks to get more of what it desires, or it thinks it needs, or it must have, and that is Venezuelan oil. So I think we're looking at a very, very dangerous moment, and this to me, as somebody who's written a book about the origins of American fascism, this is pointing more and more for me toward fascism as the end game of monopoly finance capitalism.
Okay, and before we get to that end game, let's go back to the 30s and just follow that transition, because this is the era in which it's born, and much of it's sort of the relationship that fascism as a result, or I guess as a phenomena of finance capital rule is right. Sort of that dynamic is created, I guess, in the 30s, which explain to us how that is the case, relative, let's say, the New Deal, right? I mean, okay. Which presumably on its face seemed to be maybe diametrically opposed.
Well, the New Deal is as you know, Sam, in my book, I have a chapter on the New Deal, and the chapter is called is entitled "The New Deal as a Transition to Fascism." It's a question: right. The New Deal as a transition to fascism, and this is a very, very difficult. A difficult view for us to wrap our heads around, because we identify the New Deal with a bold and successful plan to take America out of the Depression led by a political party and an individual himself who promised the common man in America an end to the Depression and a return to prosperity. But not the prosperity of the 1920s that had actually led to the crisis and led to Hoover's presidency, which showed to the world that one part of the political machinery in this country, the Republican Party, was hands down a friend of big business, and it had always been a friend of big business, and so the so-called prosperity had led to a great bust and a great crisis, and then Hoover and his friends, Hoover and the Republicans, and the people who basically in big business still sided with them, turned their back on the suffering of the American people. Roosevelt promises a New Deal, but Roosevelt is not going to go. He's not going to go down. He's not going down a socialist road. He's going to preserve capitalism. How do you preserve capitalism once it's reached its monopoly finance stage? Well, you save the monopolies and you save the banks. And of course, if you examine the New Deal, and I go over it again in my book, not in great detail because many fine historians have done that, but in essence, what the New Deal did was to stabilize the system by giving power in all of the agencies that it created, especially in the National Recovery Agency, the National Recovery Act, in which there were supposed to be codes on prices and commodities to be sold. All of this was supposed to come about in principle to create equilibrium. But the Roosevelt administration gave the power to big business to work out the arrangements that everybody else, labor, consumers, was supposed to follow. So what we get is a kind of a new development, a new level of cooperation between government and the private economy and business and the world of business. And what comes into existence for many of the people whose works I again use in my book is what is a marriage, is the culmination of a process in which government and business comes together to form a corporative whole. So many people in the 1930s are looking at the New Deal and saying, well, the New Deal promised us recovery, but again, as many of the sources revealed, the recovery was a limited recovery from 34 to 37. It was enough to save Wall Street, but not enough to bring enough prosperity to Main Street. And so you get a second New Deal in 1935 as a result of the increasing pressure on labor, because 1934 is a very, very difficult year. The New Deal has stalled, and people are beginning to wonder now why the recovery hasn't come to the vast majority of people, but business is doing well. So what you get is you get a number of writers who are looking at the New Deal, and what they see is something that resembles what Mussolini brought about in Italy, which is a cooperative state, a partnership between capital and labor that is a phony partnership because capital has all of the power, and the state is essentially sanctioning that because that's what you have to do to save capitalism. And so the New Deal does that. But in the process of doing it, it means the advance of state capitalism, which then if state capitalism goes into a crisis, then the fascist processes that require the capitalist class to maintain power become even greater, and then you get then you get something that could resemble what had happened in Italy, except that, again, these people who were writing in the 30s were saying that if fascism comes to America, or it's already coming, it's not going to look like Italy, it's not going to look like Germany, it's going to look utterly American. Its particular American form will mean that fascism, driven by the needs of big business and capitalist imperatives, could mean that fascism would evolve, would develop within the framework of the two-party system, which is what a woman named Carmen Heider argued in her 1934 book, Do We Want Fascism? And there's a need to examine what the New Deal did, what it promised, and what it actually achieved, which is opposite of what we usually think it achieved. And therein lies the problem of liberalism and the extent to which liberalism represents the interests of monopoly finance capitalism, and then to the extent to which liberalism in the end serves fascist processes. And this is startling. This is really startling.
Well, I mean, can you be more can you be more concrete in that the idea being, or let me just restate to see if I understand it. The idea being that the New Deal promises a certain level of freedom for labor through that the government will provide freedom from the four freedoms, let's say, that FDR outlines, right? From freedom from want and other sort of freedom from the shackles of material needs in many respects. And yet what it ultimately delivers is really a freedom from those things only as mediated through finance capitalism, which will it's a freedom with an asterisk, as long as you function within our parameters in terms of debt and in terms of allowing us to have more control over the economy. Then you're not going to quite get all those freedoms, but you'll get close enough that you think that it's within your reach on some level. I mean, is that essentially what we're looking at when you say?
Sam, see, there are world historical forces at work here that shape that shape what happens in the U.S. So, for example, in the spring of in 1936. Roosevelt and his cabinet are looking at the 1937-1938 budget, right? They decide. Roosevelt decides to listen to Henry Morgenthau, his Treasury Secretary, who's a conservative Democrat and a friend of big business and an advocate of big business. And Roosevelt, because he had always been a fiscal conservative, decides that, well, the government has done enough. We're on the road to recovery, so they balance the budget, right? And as a result of balancing the budget and taking federal spending out of the budget, in which the government plays a compensatory role against whatever excesses and debits, whatever doesn't happen within the private economy. And so what we get is, as a result of the contradictions, again, between production and exchange and the problem of overproduction that begins to develop in the summer of 1937, as a result of that plus the federal government balancing the budget, we get a recession in 1937. It's a recession within the Depression. And within a couple of months, 2 million people are out of work. and winter in Chicago and Detroit and many, many other northern cities is just a nightmare for millions of people, starving children out in the street again. So what does Roosevelt do in 38? He reverses himself. He admits that, yes, the liberals around me are right. That government has to be a permanent spender, balancing the budget, laissez-faire stuff is gone now. So we get the Keynesian turn, the Keynesian revolution in the U.S., which had been coming about gradually, but is complete when Roosevelt commits to that. So, and this comes. I mean, the 37 recession comes after 2 years after the Second New Deal, where workers and the American people win, and Social Security. Workers win the right to organize the union, and it was militant labor that achieved that. But then again, you see everything is on the line in a recession within the Depression. And then the government comes back and basically says, yes, okay, we're going to restore spending, and then we're going to add more to it. And some of it we're going to add is for rearmament. So the recovery is in part based on the U.S. getting ready for a war against whom? Right. A war against fascism elsewhere. And so you see, I think this is how students of history need to begin to understand fascism as not a one-time thing in Europe in the 20s and the 30s, and not as a ruthless dictatorship that as my sources say in the 30s. You have to look at the particular forms that fascism takes in different parts of the world. And what I've done in my book is to try to explain that more deeply on the basis of political economy and how the U.S. fulfills a specific role within the world economy. And ironically then, if we define fascism as a function of monopoly finance capitalism, and we follow these two writers in 1938, who said that the germ of fascism is an American monopoly capitalism in the 1920s, but it doesn't become a force of ominous proportion until the 1930s. Then, as students of history, where do we look for fascism? Do we look at just Italy and then Germany? No, we have to look at the entire capitalist world, because fascism is a unique characteristic. Unlike all the other isms that we know of, it is fascism that is unique to the contemporary world.
It's fascinating. The Coming of the American Behemoth, The Origins of Fascism in the United States. Michael Joseph Roberto, thanks so much for your time today. We'll put a link at majority.fm on the site.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Sam.
All right, folks. Going to head into the fun half, wherein we will get a little bit less involved. We'll just make fun of Nick Mulvaney, et cetera, et cetera.
I was waiting for the Professor Steve Schmidt material.
Oh, we do have a... Oh, who's this? Riptide?
Riptide has a new remix.
Oh, I like this. That's pretty good. All right, we will play this out, I guess, today. Just a reminder, this program relies on your support. You can become a member by going to jointhemajorityreport.com. When you do, we say thank you by giving you extra content every day. Also, justcoffee.coop, fair trade coffee, tea, or chocolate. Use the coupon code MAJORITY, get 10% off. Michael, today is Monday. Tomorrow will be Tuesday, as you're aware of.
Indeed.
And it is a return to the mean in terms of the Michael Brooks Show.
Yeah, people have been getting very unsettled by these schedule changes. Mark Blythe will be joining us, a legendary professor, the Beam Me Up Scotty economist. We'll be having a conversation on austerity, 2020, the economics of the election cycle, a whole bunch of other stuff. Will I be wearing a suit or a tracksuit? Find out.
Could be
Also,
it.
Patreons of TMBS are going to be getting a sneak peek at some exciting news tonight or tomorrow as well. Some West Coast related news. Patreon.com/TMBS.
And Matt?
Yeah, Literary Hangover. Coming up this Saturday is The Unparalleled Adventures of One Hans Fall by Edgar Allan Poe, which some people think is the first science fiction story.
Some people say
especially
that.
people who want to slight Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
There you go. Hey, thanks again to LifeLock Identity Theft Protection for supporting today's show. Of course, no one can prevent all identity theft or monitor all transactions at all businesses. With LifeLock, you get identity theft protection and additional features to help protect your devices against cyber threats. For as low as $9.99 a month, don't waste another second. Visit lifelock.com/majority now to save 10% on your first year. That's lifelock.com/majority for 10% off. lifelock.com/majority. We'll see you in the fun half.
Why are you doing this?
I'm doing it because I think Howard's a great guy.
Because he's a great
He
guy.
loves his family. He loves his country.
He loves his family. Oh, and he's doing it for America, too. I forgot about
What
that.
Howard Schultz thinks is that the polar opposites of the parties are so far apart, but the American people are close together. And maybe what we need is a choice for the American people to choose something different, a different path, a different
Oh
kind of
my
outcome.
God, pause it for a second. It is so beautiful. I hope he's making so much money.
Why? What his big idea is, politics is broken.
Is like a parfait of cynicism.
Politics is broken. And maybe we need a solution to it that risks the imagination of a new kind of possibility.
Yeah. Yeah. Say that one more time to me again. Yeah.
Risks the imagination of a new kind of possibility.
No, that's exactly it. We need to risk the imagination of a new type of possibility.
You're Obama with job experience.
Oh my
You're Obama with
Home
business
run.
You're the Obama
Home
that
run.
did build that.
Yeah, you're right.
Now I know why Starbucks is so huge. Wow, that is really God.
Don't help elect Trump, you egotistical billionaire asshole. Go back to getting ratioed on Twitter. Go back to Davos with the other billionaire elite who think they know how to run the world. That's not what democracy means.
Never saw that angle. Even better. Wow. There we go. Oh boy, that was good.
That was good.
I really like that.
The more I watch Bill Burton, the more I admire him.
That was pretty good. Yeah, that is impressive. I can't quite get over that. Risk the what is it again?
Risk the imagination of a new kind of possibility.
Can we like type that up and print it up and put it on like on the wall? Because I feel like our productivity in this office would probably go up like 15% if we had that on, like maybe just even post in the bathroom.
If we just
And maybe we need a solution to it that risks the imagination of a new kind of possibility.
That's my alarm in the morning.
Sit around in the office and laugh about that. Dude, you actually said it on TV. Risk the imagination of a
He's
new
like,
kind
hey,
of
man,
possibility.
that's what Howard wanted me to say.
Yeah,
You're
it
not
cost-
the one getting the check.
Paid about
moron.
$10,000 for that sentence
Yeah,
alone.
yeah.
Oh,
You know,
I got news for you.
can-
That
No,
sentence
he's
is...
talking about cost per second.
Oh.
I feel like Burton needs to go back to Schultz and be like, look at me on TV, look at Steve on that podcast. What are you doing?
Yeah, exactly. You know what,
I need a
Steve?
raise.
You know what Steve did not do during that podcast? He did not risk the imagination of a new kind of possibility. In fact,
did not.
he specifically shied away from risking the imagination of a new kind of possibility.
That's what I'm saying. You need Bill Burton out for the like, hey, you're a total opportunistic sleazebag who's undermining your entire public brand and ruining our business. You need a Burton for that. Like, I don't see it that way.
We agree to disagree.
I'd love to talk about.
We
Oh,
agree
that'd
to
be
disagree.
great. Yeah.
Agree to disagree. Let's go.
I think what Howard Schultz is
You got it,
putting
Steve.
forward,
I'm not.
it might even mean that our podcast ends up being better. Donald Trump might lose twice. Howard Schultz could be building a time machine, which means that Donald Trump didn't get elected to begin with.
Yeah, if you think time machines aren't possible, it's probably because you don't work for a billionaire.
I think it's time to drop the cynicism. I love how people who say drop the cynicism are like invariably the most cynical people on earth.
Yeah, you got to drop your cynicism to make room for my cynicism. If your cynicism exists, there's no room for my cynicism, in which case, let's talk a little bit about cynicism. I mean, I hope we're flushing the system of this stuff with Kamala Harris. You know what I mean? Like, let's try and like clean it out on some
Cranberry
level.
juice.
I hope with cranberry juice in this, because this I found a little bit cynical and a little bit just stunning. Someone asked me this morning, like, what are the problems with Kamala Harris again? And it's like, and I was like, well, they're not they're not any, I think, that ultimately are going to sink her candidacy, but they could. And I think that I probably have a greater issue with these problems than your average Democratic voter, which I think, I would like to think that's not the case.
Anecdotally, I was talking with Bree about this, and she's been following this very closely and writing on it. And no, I mean, again, we're just catching riptides from social media so far. So who sees? But that being said, it is definitely not just the usual suspects critiquing this that you'd expect. There's a much broader range of, hey, wait a second.
Yeah, I mean, it's just. I
mean, we'll see.
I'm trying to think if there
it's
was, the comparisons to Obama are inevitable because so far, at least, no one else has opened their campaign with 20,000 people at the rally. Now, right. You can say what you will or not. It's just it is an indication of at least a good organization. It is a good indication of some level of enthusiasm. And whatnot. But I don't remember at the beginning of Obama's campaign there being substantive critiques of him that there are with Kamala Harris. With that said, Obama did not have was a little bit more studious in not taking certain positions in certain, in his roles. He was a legislator.
He also wasn't a prosecutor.
And he wasn't a prosecutor.
There is some right. I agree with you that, yes, of course, there's progressive prosecutors, and you don't want to have a simplistic no prosecutor view. But, I mean, she was a highly aggressive prosecutor, which Obama was not.
Right. The highly
right.
aggressive
yes.
part is
That's
what is
the
problematic.
Problem. No, I agree. But I just
and,
wanted to add that so we didn't do this simplistic frame you don't
and like. In an era where we are still, I think, in an era of, in many respects, I think the whole Trump epoch could be considered hopefully the culmination, maybe just an era of lack of accountability for some elements of society, whereas there is an over-accountability for other elements of society. I hope I'm not being obtuse there, but the elite, the establishment, the moneyed have one set of rules, whereas those who are not have another set of rules. White people in society have lived with one set of rules, whereas people of color have lived with another, particularly in the context of law enforcement, right? I mean, that's what much of the stop and frisk was about, much of what our drug war was about. And so here is Kamala Harris on with Charlemagne.
The Breakfast Club.
The Breakfast Club. And
Charlemagne the God. Friend.
Charlemagne
the God.
Holla. We did.
Oh, no.
We did a couple of
Sorry,
shows
I didn't
together.
mean to make you mad.
But here is his interview with Kamala Harris.
Koofy?
Also, and I know the answer to this too, they say you oppose legalizing weed.
That's not true.
I know.
and look, I joke about it, half joking. Half my family's from Jamaica. Are you kidding me?
They be so mad at you. Have you ever smoked?
I have.
Okay. Like in
And
college,
I inhale. I did inhale.
Okay.
It was a long time ago. But yes.
I know you have to go. They say you have to go.
I just broke news.
I mean, was it in college? See, I like stuff like that. That's a real honest answer. Was it a blunt or joint?
It was a joint.
Hey.
Yeah.
You remember the high?
I do.
So if it was legalized all throughout the country and medicinal, would you do it?
Listen, I think that it gives a lot of people joy, and we need more joy.
We need more joy in this world.
Now, I think it's a great attitude to have, frankly. I think we would be in better shape if all our politicians had that perspective and moved towards legalization. We're basically headed there. The problem is that she has no history of promoting that position. She has that awareness. She had it in college. Her family was Jamaican, certainly, half Jamaican, certainly before now, right? She opted not to join other states in their attempts, as the AG of California, to take marijuana off the DEA's list of most dangerous substances. And this was crucially important during the Obama years, because you had some states that had legalized it or used it for medical purposes. I mean, people forget that even when states went ahead and okayed it for medical marijuana, there was still aggressive attempts by the federal government to raid these places. I mean, it's like, it seems years ago, now you can go to like legal dispensaries for just recreational use.
Ruined a lot of people's lives.
Ruined a lot of people's lives. And there were people, this is when it was medical marijuana too, and people who were desperately trying to provide relief for a whole host of people who were going through an immense amount of pain. When the Obama administration raided California's medical marijuana dispensaries, and I think this was in 2010 or 2011? Maybe it was 2012. Harris barely just put out a statement. In 2014, her Republican opponent I think it was for the, this would have been for, was it Senate?
2014 would be Senate.
Her Republican opponent ran to the left of her on the issue of criminal justice reform. Now, look, this is, I think it's a legitimate critique of, like, where are you on these subjects?
Well, I think it's,
and what's going on? It's one thing to sort of like laugh this stuff off now, but you were in a pivotal position to change the policy on this.
I also just find it very, and I'll draw a thread, because I think, there's a clip of her floating around from several years ago where she kind of laughs off a marijuana question. And I remember when Obama was president, Obama, he got some decriminalization questions early on, and he kind of was like, hey, what's the question, big stoner, kind of thing. Right. And, first of all, whatever, forget, who cares about hypocrisy. But I'll make an exception in this one, which is like, especially for people who are open about their drug use, and laudably so, but the fact that other people who got caught couldn't get college loans or spent time in prison for nonviolent offenses instead of having, a career or a family is pretty sick. But I really don't. I guess what I'm saying though is I don't like this flip where it's like almost the same tone, but the substance has shifted. It's literally like several years ago, it's ha ha ha, whatever, pothead, and now it's like ha ha ha. Of course I support it, and it's like, well, what happened in the interim? When there wasn't any substantive shift.
I think what you just said just before that is more relevant because there has been a history of her in her role as AG. Okay, look, these are documented things. There was a significant amount of support within her office to bring charges or to investigate, I should say, to start more than a preliminary investigation, because the preliminary investigation was done on Steve Mnuchin and One West, okay? She killed it. This is reporting that existed prior to her even anybody contemplating the idea that she might run for president. There is a pattern here of poo-pooing criminal justice reform. And when we talk about criminal justice reform, even the most moderate of edges of the reason why people engage in that advocacy is that the system is really unfair. And there's no one who's listening to the sound of my voice who doesn't agree with that notion, that the system is really fundamentally unfair. We know it in the context, broadly speaking, of the drug war, but we also know it just in terms of, across the board, that our criminal justice system incarcerates far, far too many people. That is unfair in terms of who is targeted and who is policed and how. And even if she was not sensitive to that issue and was across the board of harsh prosecutor, I would have less of an issue with this. But at its heart, what she does not seem to have any appreciation of or any record of appreciating is this unfairness, which she was actively engaging in and supporting. And that's what I find problematic, is that the subtextual narrative here is there are some people who deserved to pay the consequences of things, and there are other people who are not. And that, I think, is very problematic because that also can translate into policy that has nothing to do with criminal justice reform, that has to do with who government works for and who government protects. And in my mind, to the extent that there is any sign of that in the context of the work she's done, it's flipped. At least relative to what I like or to what I would want. So, I mean, that I find is a little bit problematic. We'll see. Maybe there will be other instances where, she projects something different.
I mean, of course, I just have to register that I find all over punitive approaches of any kind profoundly problematic. And I also think the other thing to add in the mix was the other piece that came out from The Intercept of her running her first DA race, or maybe it was a re-election, I think it was her first race, significantly to the right of another prosecutor who had a much more basically rehabilitation-oriented record, and her basically doing ads like MS-13 style ads, like here's a picture of a Latino guy holding a gun, throwing a sign, and we're sick of this as a city, and we need to lock people up. This is the policy, and the kind of, hacky Jamaica jokes. I mean, I don't know if that makes up for it.
Right, look.
Also, if you poll Jamaica, these might be changing, but a lot of Jamaicans supported criminalizing marijuana. That's kind of an off-Rasta joke.
Yeah,
I'm getting petty here, but it annoyed me.
I'm less concerned with
more concerned
corny
about
dad jokes type of situation.
I'm more concerned about the Jamaican humor. Of course.
But I mean, if that's the case, she feels comfortable saying that now. How did she feel comfortable before?
Right.
With all that stuff. I don't know. That's so Mick Mulvaney goes back on to Meet the Press. He's been on Meet the Press, it seems like, every weekend.
He's got
right?
a regular slot there.
Regular slot. And it seems like he says the same thing every time. And one has to wonder, who is Mick Mulvaney threatening now? Because we've already established who pays the biggest price. Well, let me put it this way. We already established who pays the first and second two biggest prices. The biggest price is paid for by, well, I guess contractors, folks who do all sorts of support staff for the federal government. They don't even get back pay. Then we see the second tier of people who pay the price, and that is federal workers. Coming in a close third in terms of a political price, it's number one. It's the Republican Party. It's the Republican Party. Now, Donald Trump obviously thinks like, it helps me by a point or two, which I'm not surprised by. And so Mick Mulvaney, I don't know who he thinks he's threatening here. But it's going to look pretty bad for Donald Trump if they have another shutdown and within 2 days you start to see workers basically say, we're not going through this again. It took us 35, 40 days last time to get to the point where we were going to start to do some work actions. We're going to do that on day 2. That's what I think is going to happen. And I would be surprised if we don't hear that from some of those unions within the next day or two where they say, guess what? We don't have the patience we had last time for this. But here's Mick Mulvaney on Meet the Press. Now, and really, what I want to know is, why isn't there a representative of the flight attendants union or the TSA union sitting right next to Mick Mulvaney and say, like, you're going to do this to us again? Good luck, buddy.
Fair to say, whatever Congress hands him, he'll sign. He just may not be enthusiastic about it.
No, I don't think so.
You're not ready to go there.
No,
you can't we cannot definitively rule out a government shutdown at the end of this week.
You absolutely cannot, and here's why.
Okay.
Let's say, for sake of this discussion, that the Democrats prevail and the hardcore left-wing Democrats prevail. There was a Democrat congresswoman who put out a tweet yesterday about $0 for DHS. So let's say that the hardcore left wing of the Democrat Party prevails in this negotiation, and they put a bill on the president's desk with, say, zero money for the wall, or $800 million, some absurdly low number. How does he sign that? He cannot in good faith sign that. It takes a presidential signature for the spending bill to
But can you imagine Senate Republicans would go along with a proposal like that? Are you that skeptical of Senate Republicans?
I don't think so, but you asked me a question.
Yeah.
Is a shutdown entirely off the table? The answer is no.
So, but $2 billion, you sit here with this loose compromise that we see, and supposedly you guys are coming to an agreement tomorrow, because in order to get it passed by the end of the week. Is that still the loose deadline?
I've been told it's today. I was at Camp David with a couple of the conference members on Friday night, and they were told to be in town today to get ready to sign a conference report.
But is it?
Yeah, guess what? That didn't work out so well. Negotiations collapsed. I guess either late Sunday or early Monday. Because they've been trading back and forth, according to this is the Washington Post. The 17-member, it was a conference committee that's between House and Senate leaders, Democrats and Republicans. They were looking at between $1.3 billion and $2 billion for the wall. I think that's probably just like the architectural fee that you would pay. Democrats also had been focused on limiting ICE's ability to detain unauthorized immigrants. Not their, it really should be capacity, not so much their ability. Because it basically said, hey, this whole thing where you're now housing 15,000 kids and where you keep finding money to build more and more detention centers, we're not down with that anymore. The proposal from the Democrats included a limit on the number of detention beds for immigrants in the interior of the country. They wanted to cap that number at 16,500. That's the number of the level of interior detentions in the final years of the Obama administration. This is inside the country, not at the border. And apparently the Republicans said, no way. We want to be this is a growth business for us. And so talks have broken down. We shall see what happens next. It can get very disorienting to follow this on a day-by-day basis. But
is that just like keeping him in some type of like emotional equilibrium for the next, like, we talk tough, and then whatever like fake deal we get, we're gonna say that it was because we talk tough? That's
definitely part of it. I think so. I also think that there are people in the White House who might have, an idea that either the American public is more anti-immigrant than they think it is, or that that they maybe they need to run against the Republicans on this too. Let's go to the phones. Calling from a 310 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Hi, Sam. This is Sammer from New York. How are you?
Good. How you doing? Who's this, Sammer?
Yeah, Sammer.
Okay.
It's an Egyptian name. I usually go by Samer, but I thought of giving you my real name. Now, have you listened to Joe Rogan on Friday?
No.
All right, so he had a guest. I don't know him, but maybe you do. Tim Pool, and he said the Green New Deal, it included economic security for people who are not willing to work.
That's correct.
This is correct?
Well, it speaks to people. For instance, I can tell you that the chief of staff, AOC's chief of staff spoke to this. There are instances, right? Let's say you are 55 years old, and you're a minor.
Okay.
You're a minor, and you're starting to contract black lung disease, and you stop working because or the coal business, let's say, is drying up. You're 50 years old. Let's just say that. Coal business drying up. You're 50 years old, 55 years old. It is conceivable, and I think quite justifiably, that someone that age living in West Virginia thinks, I'm not going to be able to find a new job. I'm not going to go into some type of training program because it offers training also for these folks, where I'm going to go and learn some other trade at age 50, and I'm not going to find any new work. I think providing support for that for folks like that, if they, they'll say, all right, I'm going to go do some part-time work or whatnot, but that's not going to sustain them, obviously, right? I mean, you can't live on that. I think providing, I think providing material support. I think providing material support for them is worthwhile. I think it addresses an important reality that, in the context of this business, I mean, like this. Imagine it juxtaposed to the idea of Medicare for all. A lot of people have made a lot about there's going to be 2 million people put out of work if we go to a single payer system because the private insurance industry is going to go away. The private insurance industry is going to go away, but wait a second, Samir. But all those people who work, not all, but the vast majority of those people who work on administrative things dealing with health insurance are going to find new work in the context of Medicare for all. And this is not the same as having a specific skill like I'm a coal miner. How am I going to transition at age 50? You're going to have to provide support for these people. And for some, it's going to be job retraining. And for others, it may just be early retirement. I mean, we see the buyouts all the time, right? I mean, this is how We see Ford offering buyouts to engineers because they're not going in a certain direction with a certain type of thing that they're developing. People take buyouts. And so this is basically a buyout for, coal miners or people who are engaged in some of these fossil fuel businesses that are going out of business. That's all.
No, but there is a difference between people who are put out of work because of automation or because the industry went away and they are too old to be retrained, in which case these people are not able to work, not unwilling to work. The wording when you say they are for people not willing to work, it's as if those are young, healthy people who just do not want to work and they will get money from the government. This is what the wording means, unwilling. If you are willing to work, but your skills are no longer in need, and you are 50 or 55, this is not a situation where you be labeled as unwilling to work.
I mean, I guess. I mean, that's the language they chose. Maybe they could have chosen better language. But that's the idea behind it.
You know, it's like you cannot make Fox News happier. But, this is a stupid choice of wording. That's what I think. It should not be because I understand the concept of universal basic income and that there are people who will be put out of work and they will have no chance of earning, an income and they're too old or they do not have a college degree. But the idea is if these people are able to make a living, then they will not be in need of the government.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure, go ahead.
How many jobs do you work? More than one job yourself?
I work 80, 90 hours a week.
Yeah. So does the
worker.
frame of it just kind of offend you because of how hard you're working, on some level?
No, no. I've been in times when I could not work, and I understand. And you can get fired from a job, or I'm an Uber driver, so if I lose my license today, I'm fucked. So I understand that there are times, and it does happen, that people can be in need, and if I get a medical injury, I will never be able to work for the rest of my life. For example, if I'm in a wheelchair or something, it's not that, but it's the idea of the wording of being, willingness. That if you're not willing to work, this is not the same as not able to work.
Yeah,
there is a big difference.
Okay.
Here, I wonder. I may be projecting on you, but I just know, like, even people that, like in my family, who are 100% on board with all of these policy sets, 100%. And there's something about that kind of word choice, given their own sort of work backgrounds. My
understanding is that is that wording is from. I mean, this is according to The Hill on Saturday. That the what was being floating around with that language was an early draft of an FAQ that I don't think is in part of the resolution, but I'll dig into it. But the concept is people who are, it's not quite unable to work, but look, you can't be an Uber driver necessarily in coal country and make anything close to a living. I it's getting increasingly harder to, frankly, to even do it in New York. But so there's, I think that is what it's addressing, but I'll look into it.
And I think the man clearly is not opposed to the merits of it. I do think
appreciate the call.
That language for whatever it is worth.
No, I'm not opposed to
of course not. I know.
Income, but I really think the wording and the concept go.
Yeah,
hand in
I'm
hand.
not sure the wording. Let me double check on this, Samir. Okay, Samir, listen. Let me check the wording. Let me check the wording on that. Can we pull up the resolution and just someone go through that and see how it's represented now? Colleen, speaking of the flight attendants union, they have already called for a strike if the government shuts down again. There you go. So, A Square, Sam, fascinating and depressing interview. Obama did something similar. No, he saved capitalism for the fascists. On Friday, and Friday hit the nail on the head. That money was in part from Melania increasing the prenup payout big league. I think her so-called friend got spooked when she found out how much money was being moved through her. Some people prefer to steal a little versus a lot. Guessing she was not sure if she would be literally holding the bag. Yeah, I have feelings. I think so. Chappie, remember how Mondale said, I will raise your taxes and so will Reagan? The difference is he won't tell you that. Turned out not to be the greatest strategy.
Doesn't look like the word unwilling appears anywhere in this document.
Okay, so, I mean, what was being spread around was an early draft of the FAQ that was basically a shorthand for saying folks who are in a predicament where they don't have a physical malady, but they do have a malady. They don't have a physical malady, but they do have basically it. They just think it's going to be too difficult. It's a buyout, essentially. It's a buyout. Aggrieved Schmidt. Sam, if someone from the MR universe were to sell out, consult for a lame candidate, and then, when called on it, storm off in a huff, who, other than Michael, would it be?
Well, here's the difference. I would be the first to take that contract, no doubt, after Sam, but I would Bill Burton it. I would love to spend 3 hours being like, no, I think you guys are missing the optimism of the promise of the moment of the opportunity.
It's actually kind of a challenge. Like, can you put enough verbiage out there that makes your boss happy, but also maintain some kind of like, maybe I'm doing this just for the money?
I would have fun doing that.
Listen, I like to think that every member of the Majority Report staff, when after selling out, would not storm off the set and talking about it, that they would all have the ability to spin a yarn about how, their grandpappy wanted them to do something.
Yeah, I mean,
like
come
this.
on, man. There's some good talent here. Give us some credit.
Yeah, exactly.
We're not all like guys who consulted for Dick Cheney and sit around MSNBC and apparently are on the verge of a psycho-emotional breakdown at like the slightest hint of questioning.
Look, it's that $7 million's got to weigh on your head, and every night, like 7 million.
It's like
10
the
million,
meme from Chappelle's
5 million,
show.
who knows?
When he marries Oprah, and every time he thinks she's gonna finally get fed up with him, he has a gold crown and he just holds bundles of money.
New Human. Someone needs to write a book about this Schultz campaign that gets adapted into a movie, because I want to see Woody Harrelson reprise his new part of Steve Schmidt's life. Zero Sum Sam. So what does right-wing Mandela think about this Bolsonaro?
Bolsonaro.
Well, to tell you the truth, I need to read more about him. I'm not totally sure, but seems to me like he doesn't like Marxism, and he's taking the SJWs out of the school and really like making Brazil big in the world again. So that's good.
Rams ain't. Hey, Sam, great interview today. Wanted to let your listeners know that if you want to hear a beautiful singing voice, they should check out the nudist episode of Bob's Burgers to hear your breathtaking rendition of the theme song from The Karate Kid. That's true. That's available. I think it's available on Spotify.
The tenor Andrea Bocelli.
Buried Weiss. Recently, a friend of mine said that AOC's Green New Deal was useless because it doesn't majorly scale back U.S. military presence abroad. I'm still formulating an answer. What's your response? I would need more information. I would need more information as to what that's about.
If I feel like this is so. I have real quick. I think sometimes there's a certain left tendency, which is just to like sometimes even bring in things that are relative non sequiturs to like poo-poo anything, because there's a kind of like comfort and familiarity with always just being opposed. On the other hand, if the point is we need to have a Green New Deal can't happen in one country without some kind of like global coordination with other countries' energy policies, that's true. So what I would say is that Yanis Varoufakis, who knows how well they'll do, but they're campaigning on Euro-wide elections on a Green New Deal for Europe, and actually not on issues like clear cutting in Africa. There's huge. I mean, China has a lot of problems, but China is actually transitioning to renewables much faster than we are. So there is seeds of this elsewhere.
What's that Meet the Press one you got up there, the Brody?
Oh yeah, that's Katie Tur versus David Brody on climate change.
Oh, okay, yeah. This is actually. All right, let's get to that in a minute, but I would rather let's. So apparently, the latest in Virginia is that we have credible, increasing reports that the Lieutenant Governor Fairfax was involved in sexual assault in 2004 at the DNC. committed, I should say, sexual assault. There's another report that claims that he sexually assaulted and I think allegedly raped a woman in college. The reports are out there. We'll see where that stands. There's mounting pressure on Fairfax to resign. There are some people who are talking about impeachment. Obviously, these type of charges are, I don't want to say far more, but I think are significantly more serious than the idea of a guy wearing blackface or a hood in his picture in medical school. That's certainly Northam's calculation. He seems determined to stay in office and to rededicate his office to anti-racism. And he has picked up Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, and I'm not joking. And I think, did he also?
He did The Case for Reparations, the magazine piece, and then Roots.
Ungawa Black. Yeah, The Roots is not good. You should have watched The Roots in the 70s, right? That's a little. I get Ta-Nehisi Coates is pretty current, but Roots.
Well, maybe the book is a little bit more sophisticated than the miniseries.
It is. The book is great, but I believe it was also released in the 70s.
Yes. Well, that's just part of it. He's just covering the all the bases. But here he is. Apparently, he didn't get to the part yet where we refer to what position we put people coming over from Africa. Well, I should not say coming over. People being taken from Africa and brought here. Nobody gave him. He hasn't got to that part in Roots yet where they refer to them as slaves.
I know this has been a very difficult week for you in the state of Virginia. So where would you like to begin?
Well, it has been a difficult week, and if you look at Virginia's history, we're now at the 400-year anniversary. Just 90 miles from here, in 1619, the first indentured servants from Africa landed on our shores in Old Point Comfort, what we call now Fort Monroe. And while
also known as slavery.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
now
listen.
Oh yes,
now,
of
listen,
course,
listen,
of course.
Listen. To be fair, in colonial Virginia, okay, they were women were brought over to be indentured servants in colonial Virginia. This is back, I guess, I think it's like getting a little hair splitting. He wanted to, I think, show.
Well, so I think he might have got a lesson that he didn't entirely take in correctly. So before in 1619, the first 19 or so African slaves did come to the United States, to Jamestown, Virginia. Now, there was about 1,000 indentured servants already there. The reason that those slaves were called indentured servants was because that they, let's see, I have this right here. The first 19 or so Africans to reach the English colonies arrived in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619, brought by Dutch traders who had seized them from a captured Spanish slave ship. So they were slaves. And then because those Spanish ships baptized them, in English law, you couldn't have slaves that were baptized. So they called them indentured servants.
Oh, so there you have it. I mean, I think we are maybe missing the forest for the trees when we when we call them indentured servants. I mean, you could, the fact is that Virginia could have basically called them whatever they wanted, which I think is indicative of why we really should refer to them as slaves.
Right. Anyways, that's Spanish common law. If you like, I could do the moonwalk for you. But if there's nothing else to cover, I got to go listen to Africa Bombata and the Zulu Nation up on old 8-track up in the governor's mansion. Cause I'm right now, it's actually really an interesting time in my self-education right now because I'm listening to hip-hop from exactly the same era I was in blackface. So if you'll excuse me. Got more education to do.
That's also why they like to imagine that black people were from an entirely different line of creature than white people were, because it made it easier to enslave them and not mess with the Bible so much.
Right. He walks out whistling Dixie. Oh, I shouldn't have done that. My bad.
Hey, speaking of white privilege, and one of the things that we as white guys always have the ability to do is to talk about is to have a certain amount of delusion about was so much so that even in a loss, and this is clip number 9, even in a loss, we can talk about how this reflects well on us. And I don't just mean, oh, it reflects well on us because we did our best and whatnot. It is, well, here is Joe Crowley talking about how much he helped AOC simply by existing.
Part of it is because she beat me. I mean, so I take some, I take some solace in that.
Explain.
Well, that I was important enough that people actually took note of someone beating me, which is important.
You're saying the way that when Eric Cantor lost, he was in leadership, he was a big figure. You were a big figure in leadership, and so beating someone as big as you.
Yeah, and I think that didn't happen overnight for me. It took 20 years to, or I should say 16 or 14 years to get to that point of leadership. But I also think, it's important to say I didn't underestimate her, and I appreciate her.
Pause it. Now, so his point is the reason why she is so well known today is because she beat him. You remember, of course, and Melber, makes it, draws the parallel with the beating of Eric Cantor. You remember, of course, how David Bratt was the cause célèbre in Washington for months after he beat Eric Cantor. Oh my gosh. It was David Bratt this.
David Bratt dancing on a rooftop.
Or should I call
when
him
that video
DB,
footage?
as we affectionately called him around here. Old DB. And all the great proposals he rolled out. Boy, oh boy. I don't think so. But let's listen. Joe, he's got some more stuff to say about how much he helped her by being him.
Underestimate her, and I appreciate her point about that. There were a lot of factors that went into the race, and probably more time that we'd have to talk about that. But I wish her well, and I want her to do well. I want to do well on behalf of my constituents and for the country as well.
Yeah, they're not your constituents anymore, Chief.
He also took her so seriously that he sent a former councilwoman in his place to debate Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
That's because I take Hispanic broad so seriously. What do you know?
There you go. It would have been. He was so well placed in leadership. It would have been unfair.
I
to do that.
I like how he's becoming Boston in this impression. I like that.
Well, if you're
if I wasn't in leadership, no one would know who this little Puerto Rican broad is. But look, I wish you the best.
Wait, what's he doing now?
Isn't
he doing? He did some.
It's on K Street somewhere.
Yeah, lobbying thing.
If she had any courtesy, she would help my clients.
Exactly. That's the thing. She really. I hope she appreciated how much me being me helped her to be her. It's always the guy behind the girl.
Who she was because of who I was, allowing her to be who she was.
It's just it's just unbelievable, right? Like there's just that's what true grit is. It's being a white guy and always being convinced that even the success of others as they beat you is a function of how great you are.
It's like being a Chiefs fan and saying we were so tough for the Patriots that they had to beat us, and through beating us, it's really what made them the championship team.
Exactly. Even that has actually a little more validity.
Yeah.
On some level, because it's we toughened them up, but
Ryan Grimm pointed out that it is true that they did spend a lot of money to try to beat back AOC. So it's not necessarily that they just underestimated her. That's not why AOC won. There was some genuine, reasons besides.
I think everything he said there is totally fine, except for the "she is who she is because of me" part.
Yeah. All right. Well, what clip is this of? This is Elizabeth Warren from her announcement in 2020, and The messaging is pretty good here, and it's going to be interesting to see how much it resonates. I think there's well, let's listen to what she has to say.
Subsidies for corporations that pollute. That's what a rigged system looks like. Too little accountability for the rich, too little opportunity for everyone else. Now, when I talk about this, some rich guys scream, class warfare. Well, let me tell you something. These same rich guys have been waging class warfare against hardworking people for decades. I say it's time to fight back.
That's pretty good. A little tougher to get a major crowd in 30-degree weather. And Lawrence, Massachusetts, just to put that in context for people, is a former industrial city that is seen better times. Really, over the past 40, 50 years. It's been...
the mill closure started early in Mass. It's a good place for her to be.
We'll see. The big questions for Warren are going to be, can she raise enough money to stay in the race while I get the sense other people are going to be fighting? Like, I don't think there's a lot of candidates out there who are going to be focusing their ire on her. And in many respects, the question's going to be, can she stay in the race, to Super Tuesday, let's say? Can she have the money to compete in Super Tuesday? And perhaps, because Super Tuesday, one of two things could happen. It's a little bit early to make this assessment. But Super Tuesday could either consolidate a lot of strength behind one person, or it's going to disperse and make it possible for other people to sort of sneak in. We shall see. Let's turn towards the Whitaker hearings. These were Friday, just before we went on air. There was no big takeaways from this. Other than that, Whitaker, I think, largely was playing to and I think other people have said this, to an audience of one. He was looking for, it seems to me, either another job in the administration or a job back in the conservative movement from whence he came. So when he says to the chair of the committee, God, I can't even remember his name right now. Who is it? Yeah, Nadler. When he says to Nadler, you've used up your 5 minutes, like an a-hole, that was a calculated attempt to be an a-hole. That was not a misstep. That was a marketing ploy. And it's going to sell with Donald Trump as Donald Trump looks for, a chief of staff. And it's going to sell with the Adelsons out there who pay big bucks for, particularly former U.S. attorneys who can have some air of legitimacy theoretically. And Jamie Raskin, congressman from Maryland, digs into this part of Whitaker's background.
It's been reported publicly that there was one donor. And as we understand it, I think you're testifying today that you were the sole employee of the group. So there was one donor and one employee. Do you know who the donor was?
All right, pause it. We should just be clear. He was a one-man political action, not political action group, but I think advocacy group. I don't know what the name of it was. It's like here it is. It's like the judicial, something like, and I understand this is not unprecedented. The Catholic League, do people remember that with that guy?
Oh yeah, I do.
I can't remember his name now. But he was this Catholic guy who would, No, every time somebody would say anything about Bill Donahue, anytime anybody would say anything critical of the church, Bill Donahue would show up on television as the president of the Catholic League. Well, he was not only the president, it was like sort of like, I'm not only president, I'm a client, I'm also the sole member.
I'm also the treasurer. I'm also the vice president. And a lot of those relationships with kids was very romantic. And I thought you guys were opposed to homophobia.
He had a secretary in his office, and that was it. That was the organization. We've heard a lot less of him since it turned out that there was a reason why people were talking about those priests. But so here's Raskin basically saying, you were a one-man band here and got paid $1.3 million. What was going on?
Donor and one employee. Do you know who the donor was to the group that funded your salary for $1.3 million?
Yes, I do.
Who was the donor?
The donor was another nonprofit 501c3 organization called the Donors Trust.
Okay, now that was the pass-through vehicle, but who reached into their pocket and wrote the check to go through that to pay your salary?
Congressman, as you know, because you've looked at this issue, the Donors Trust is much bigger than the Foundation for Accountability and Civic Trust and raises millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars every year. I actually, as I sit here today, have no idea who the donors to Donors Trust that then funded
thank you.
the
All right, well then I've got a theory that I want to float with you, and it goes to something very strange that's been happening at the Department of Justice recently. A casino billionaire and magnate Sheldon Adelson hates online gambling for obvious reasons. It's competition for him. He wants people in the casinos, not online. And he spent more than $1 million lobbying Congress to override a 2000 opinion by the Office of Legal Counsel, DOJ, saying that the Wire Act plainly prohibits only sports gambling online, not gambling in the states, which is why Florida, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, lots of states have built important businesses for themselves online. But Congress wouldn't change the law according to the demands of Mr. Adelson. So rather than change the law, he decided to try to get the Department of Justice to change the interpretation of the law. And he threw millions into a campaign to remake the DOJ and get the Office of Legal Counsel to perform a complete reversal and say that the Wire Act bans the kinds of lotteries that states run online, even though its language plainly prohibits only sports betting. And when Donald Trump won and Mr. Sessions became AG and you became Chief of Staff, DOJ leadership ordered a reevaluation of this legal question. And what do you know? The Office of Legal Counsel found some subtle and invisible points of law that apparently escaped the Department of Justice back in 2011, and it reversed the plain reading of the interpretation, which talks specifically.
There you go. I don't know why we cut it off there, but that's what we call good business, folks. That's good business. If there's been a law that's passed that says you can't do something, and you can't get the law changed, you can get the people who interpret the law changed, maybe, right?
You threw a lot of words at me there, and I don't understand all of them, but I'm going to take it as offense.
The conservatives might have got that point by this. They just change the judges. We'll be good.
Yeah, right.
There was one other moment where Whitaker is questioned by Veronica Escobar. She's a Democrat from Texas. And I think that's from a border district. There is a new policy. We talked about this briefly last week, where called Remain in Mexico. It basically says to refugees, you no longer come to the States to go through the process of declaring or seeking refugee status. You got to stay in Mexico. Now, I get the problem with this is that to the extent that a lot of these people have relatives in the United States, they know that they have a place to go while they wait to find out their disposition in terms of their refugee status. It is also significantly safer in the United States for them. There is a reason why these people travel in caravans. It is because they're afraid to travel as individuals. And the fears can range from anywhere from, I would imagine, the gangs that they are trying to avoid in their home cities and countries, perhaps the domestic abuse that they have suffered, they're trying to avoid. United States basically issued a new rule that said you can't come in here, that we're going to set up an office in Mexico where you apply for asylum. It is the most radical change to asylum practices that we've had in this country, in the history of this country. Here is Veronica Escobar asking Matthew Whitaker about it, the guy who would oversee this process from the DOJ.
The Department of Justice oversees the Executive Office for Immigration Review. Will the Department of Justice ensure that asylum seekers have access to counsel in Mexico in order to allow them to prepare for their hearings? Yes or no?
We're going to continue to follow the policies at EOR that are currently in place.
Will you facilitate, assist, help ensure that asylum seekers have access to legal counsel in Mexico? Yes or no?
Congresswoman, there is a very well-defined process for asylum seekers to obtain counsel, and we're going to continue to follow that. Of course,
Mr. Whitaker, even while they're in Mexico?
as the acting attorney general, I cannot make an assurance, especially regarding what happens in a foreign country. I mean, I know you understand that.
And this is part of the reason why this is such a terrible policy.
So, in other words, U.S. statute say that we have to provide a legitimate system for adjudication, which involves providing some form of representation for these folks. And the way that we're avoiding that is like, well, our hands are tied. It's happening in Mexico. Why is it happening in Mexico? Oh, because we moved it to Mexico. That's basically what we're seeing there. Oh, it's a real shame. Apparently, they don't have the capacity in Mexico to deal with this. But there's nothing we can do. We don't control Mexico.
Hey, we're all for legal immigration. All
Totally.
of us in the Republican Party.
Totally.
I'd like to take this opportunity to say I support legal immigration. Thank you very much. Oh my God, he's such a tough guy. He's going to protect me.
So tough.
Going to protect me.
You're like a football player. Like a big football player.
Big guy.
Such a big guy. Oh, here's an update. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, you know that Turning Points USA is an organization that's dedicated to speaking to the youth in this country, and specifically college-age youth. That's what their whole processes is for. That's why they raise millions of dollars every year from respective donors, right? And because they're dealing with the incredible suffering of conservatives on college campuses, how they're shut out of the conversation. And so TPUSA, headed by Charlie Kirk and Candace, domestic fascism's okay, Owens.
Hitler in 3 parentheses Owens.
Well, they put out all sorts of videos and advertisements and propaganda. Should we sample one first? Yeah, let's sample one. This is an example of one of the things that they put out. And let's check this bad boy out. This is We Gave You Liberty. This is an image of George Washington, but you couldn't figure out how to pay for the roads without stealing from others. Here we go.
It's George Washington rolling his eyeballs.
Is there no sound?
No, there's no sound. We can find one with sound.
It's just one image? That's a video?
Yeah, you see, look at his eyes move.
Oh.
Yeah.
Pretty clever stuff. So there it is. We gave you liberty, but you couldn't figure out how to pay for roads without stealing from others. That's the old chestnut that taxation is theft, and et cetera, et cetera.
What suggestion do they have besides taxes, I wonder?
Private.
Okay, yeah.
Private. So somebody looked at the statistics for how well these some of their ads, this is the taxation is theft, how well they perform. Because remember, this is targeted to college youth. They spend, young people. They spend a lot of time online.
Finally, someone's talking to them.
Yeah, finally. Let's take a look at this here. There's over $100 spent on this. 1 to 5,000 impressions, I guess. Let's look in deep here. And they have locations of where this thing is. Texas, Ohio, that's big. Oh, that's important. Florida, Indiana, Michigan. And let's look here. Does very well with men, it appears like. That's odd. 65 and over represents 22% of the people that that watch this video. Okay, a fifth, 65 and over. 14% women, 65 and over. And does very well with folks between the ages of 55 and 64. In fact, that is the highest performing group. 26% of the impressions this ad are looked at by people at 55 to 64 or older. I should say men, only 7%, but that is the second highest number.
It's about a third if you include women.
There you go. Yeah. And then 45 to 54, make up 17% of the audience of this, 2% of women in that category. And then 35 to 44, it's a little younger. Now this, it's only 6%. You shouldn't freak out about that because
they're grads.
They're not college students. They're out of school. That's not who it's meant for. 25 to 34, also not out of they're out of school for the most part, but maybe they're still interested in the message that they heard at TPUSA.
They're still recovering.
Only 1%. Now let's see. I'm trying to do my math here. 22 plus 26 plus 17% plus 6 and 1%, and then there was another 2 and 7 and 14%. Oh, that's why from 18 to 24. This is the audience that it's targeted to. College students, 0%. That doesn't mean no one, but it does mean probably like 5 or 10 people.
Wait, you're telling me that the George Washington eye roll isn't burning up the college?
All right, but wait a second. This is going to perform much better because this is a picture of AOC saying a society that allows billionaires to exist is wrong. And then
that's going to piss kids off.
And then they have a nail-biting white girl model who says, if we confiscated 100% of the wealth of every billionaire in America, we'd have enough money to run the federal government for less than 8 months. Our problem isn't how much billionaires have, it's how much politicians spend. Turning Points USA. Well, that one performed much, much better. In fact, it started 0%. It's tough to say what it's a multiple of, but that one only did 1% of its audience was 18 to 24. But the good news is that it picked up 1% between the 13 and 17-year-old crowd. But once again, 55 to 64-year-olds, 20% of the audience was interested in that.
So the real good news is that Foster Freeze liked it.
Foster Freeze
people are still
loved
getting employed to do this
There you
nonsense.
go. And there's another AOC, warns the end is near. And this one,
struck out.
Well, they did really well with 45 to 54, but it's 0% for 18 to 24. Yeah, I know.
Think about that. Like, this is just somebody who does really good. Like, if you're just doing basic social media verticals, like, oh, yeah, include her in the tag, throw her in the name, whatever. They can't even barnacle numbers off of her name.
Well, all right, here's where they get smart, because now they're talking about a college leftist. And this is a video of
the
a
real deep
college
stuff
leftist. Quote, semicolon, there are over 100 genders, she was arguing, and that garnered 21% of the audience came from the 45 to 54-year-old, 1% college kids.
Yeah, got up 50 to 100K impressions on that too, so they
did well. Yeah,
20,000 50-year-old men saw it.
So. Charlie Kirk is going to what is the other organization he could run? And instead of Turning Point, like already turned point, maybe.
Post turning.
Yeah.
No more turns USA.
Turn Point or just like straight ahead USA.
Over the hill point.
Over the hill point USA.
Wow.
Death's door point.
That stuff makes us look like a teeny bopper show.
Ooh, 300 genders. That's crazy, say.
The kids will love that.
Yeah,
Let's
kids
go
will
to
love this.
Go to the phones. Calling from a 706 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Hey, this is Lauren.
Lauren? Hello? Hello? Hello?
Hey there?
Yeah. Who's this?
Sorry, this is Lauren calling from Alabama.
What's on your mind?
You guys had, I appreciate everything you guys do, by the way.
Thank you.
You guys had someone call in, like Friday, and he said he was, from Georgia and Alabama, and, he said, I go back and forth between Alabama and Georgia, so I think I have sort of the same background as he does, and I think his basic argument was like the South wasn't as racist because like I really didn't get what his argument was that the South was less racist, but from personal experience, I mean like the South, like it's extremely racist here. Like it's like blatantly, it's blatantly racist. Like I have anecdotal incidents, and I also like, I mean, I was a kid like when Obama was kind of running for election, but like I remember like the day after he was elected. A bathroom in my middle school, a boys' bathroom in my middle school was like vandalized with KKK shit all over it. And before he was even officially like elected into office, there were spikes of hate crimes and like black families waking up with like burning crosses on their front lawns, and like it was a serious like hate crimes rose for about a good solid year. And it was insane. So to say that the South isn't as racist as it's perceived is kind of, it's insane. Like, I think the North, like people in the North, they're racist, but they're not as covertly. They're not as blatantly racist. It's more covert, and I don't know if that's what he was trying to say, but I mean the South is extremely racist. It's just. And the North is also extremely racist, but the South is racist in a completely different and systematic way.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to the extent that I've heard from folks, via emails, they tend to echo what you're saying. And that's not to say everyone in the South is racist. It's not to say that the South isn't changing, but there's a long history of it, and it's also not to say that there isn't racism in the North, and it may be different in some ways. It may be, and I don't know, it's I don't know if it's quantitative or qualitative.
One example I can
go ahead.
I mean, one example I can think of for like an example of racism in the North is I think I read. This was a few years back in like 2015, but it was something like schools in New York are more segregated than schools in like Mississippi and Georgia and things like that.
New York City schools are some of the most segregated in the country. It is not by design, and the school system is constantly trying to deal with it. But the hard part is that so much of it is about gentrification and the way that neighborhoods get formulated, and the difficulty in trying to figure out a way of maintaining some diversity in schools. I mean, it is an ongoing struggle. There is, on one level in the city, there's an attempt. They just changed, at least in I don't know if this was a citywide thing, but within the district that I live in Brooklyn, they changed the middle schools to a complete lottery system. Now, the problem with that, the difficulty for some, is that, well, if my kid gets into a school that takes like literally an hour for him to get to, when I have a school that is 10-minute walk from here. That doesn't work out that well. The problem is, though, is that if I'm living in a wealthier neighborhood, that 10-minute walk, that school is going to be appreciably better because the parents, largely because it's just going to be better funded. And so there's a lot of different things that go into that. But I would also argue, look, we know that there were 2 counties in New York City that were under the pre-clearance conditions of the Voting Rights Act. So yeah, the East is not. The North rather is not. It's not racist free. It's a different type of racism.
I think it's more like polite racism. Like, not polite, but I think you know what I mean.
It's not quite as public
and just like
up in the North.
Yeah,
I appreciate.
Yeah, like there's some shame, I think, whereas here it's kind of more shameless. Like, again, I'm young, and like Obama was president when I was in high school, and I constantly heard Obama like being called the N-word. It was like every single fucking day. Like it was disgusting, and I remember I actually got into a lot of shit because I told a person to stop doing that, and they got really fucking pissed. And I also wanted to bring up another thing. And I don't know if you guys have seen this, but Laura Loomer has been emailing Joe Rogan and begging him to go on her podcast. And she says because she was banned from Facebook, Uber, Lyft, Uber Eats, Medium, GoFundMe, Venmo, and PayPal, that she's the most dangerous that she's the most dangerous journalist in modern times.
I totally agree. Nothing but respect from us to her. Definitely nothing that anybody needs to be. She doesn't need to deal with us. We don't need to deal with her.
She doesn't seem dangerous at all.
Appreciate the call.
She seems super, I would say, highly stable, highly safe.
Appreciate the call.
Very stable. Very safe.
I've been rejected from Seamless and from...
Very stable and very cool.
Very stable, very cool. Yeah, she just wrote the review she wrote at the Lebanese restaurant on Seamless maybe was a little overboard. Maybe should have counted to 10.
Calling from a 509 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Sam, this is Ronald Reagan.
Ronald Reagan. How are you, sir? You getting any sleep?
Yeah. Eventually your body just shuts down.
Right. No, I understand.
And it just takes care of all that. You know?
Yep. Been there.
Shout out to all the women out there who don't have that option. They have to keep those little creatures alive, and it's real work.
Yeah.
Sam, I wanted to say 2 things. First of all, Northam, that's the guy, right? The Virginia guy.
Yeah.
And also this Kamala Harris clip where she's joking about weed, like she's, down with the cause.
Yeah.
These people have me thinking about, how we want to give space for real change, and how that sort of it hits close to home as somebody who was raised like very conservative, and I don't think I was ever terrible, but I know for sure I was homophobic and said things were gay or don't be a fag or whatever, stuff like that. And I feel horrible about that. And it's something that I think when you have made real change, you should be able to very instinctively issue a heartfelt apology and to explain your progress and your journey to other people. And what both of those people have done just strikes me as like, a real lack of reckoning or just pure bullshit in the case of Kamala Harris.
Well, I don't even think that she's acknowledging any change.
Well, exactly, and I don't think he is either, really. You know?
Well, he's trying to, at least, like, he's reading about reparations, and he's like saying, like, I'm trying to become more sensitive to this.
Watching Roots, man.
He's reading Roots. He's reading it. Although I bet you he watches it.
Walked off the
LeVar Burton. Wasn't he in Star Trek?
Exactly. No, but I think you're right about this. Like, look, and we said this in the context of Northam. We said it in the context of even Kavanaugh. Like, if you acknowledge that, you did something wrong, you had an understanding that was wrong, particularly in your youth, and that's changed. Like, obviously, you would want it to be sincere, but at the very least, like, have the it's not even the political savvy. It's like, you're a public figure. It is important for you, even if you're being cynical and disingenuous about it. There is value still, even if Northam is just doing it to save his own political hide, to get up in front of people and say, like, I have a greater understanding now of what was wrong about what I did, so that you can actually provide some positive benefit for society, for young people. I mean, for Kamala Harris to say, like, in my role as a prosecutor, I realized I was a little bit myopic, and maybe I was a little bit, maybe I was too single-minded and too focused on this, to the exclusion of seeing the real pain and the real underlying dynamic that was going on in society. And I've seen that. And my experience as a prosecutor, in some ways, it kept me from seeing it as a prosecutor, but now enhances my vision of it. And I understand why criminal justice reform is so important in a way that I don't know that I could have. At least, it may be disingenuous, right? And it may be, but at least there's some benefit. Like, you're pushing the ball forward, even if you're doing it from a cynical perspective. They don't even have a clue as to, like, they don't even care enough to do that.
In a way, like, their refusal to address it in an honest way is, maybe not worse, but just as bad as the underlying problem.
It could be worse.
I think it's often worse, in my opinion, because, as you said in yourself, we're all of us are fallen. All of us are far from perfect. And all of us have made mistakes, but the process of improving is really ultimately the test for most things. I mean, and I agree with you. I think Northam is making a fool of himself, but Harris isn't even acknowledging the shifts, which is weird to watch.
Yeah, super weird. Let me also just real quick talk about ICE detention, because that's apparently the new border wall. And this is anecdotal, just in my own experience, but 3 quick things on how, or anecdotes, I guess, on how ICE detention currently works. The system is already driven by bed space. So if there's bed space available, they'll fill it, and they'll fill it sort of regardless of the underlying facts or circumstances of the detainees. So I know I may have told this story earlier on the show, but sometime last year I had 2 people detained sort of back to back. One had no criminal history. Only one of them was detained. The first person had no criminal history, and he was sent to this private geo detention on the other side of the state. It's a jail, right? And a couple of weeks later, I had a lady who was arrested for DUI, and she was not detained, which was unusual. And so I was happy that she wasn't detained by ICE. I mean, she'd already been detained by local law enforcement and done her, the judge let her out of county jail, and ICE elected not to detain her in ICE custody. And I asked the officer, how are these decisions being made? And he said, well, 1, it's a function of who's making the call, and 2, which ICE officer makes the decision, and 2, it's a function of bed space. So if they have bed space, they'll detain somebody like the first guy with no criminal record, with kids born in the U.S. with, dozens of years in the country, taxpayer, et cetera. They'll detain that person just by virtue of having a bed available, which means on the back end, sometimes people who do have criminal history don't get detained.
What's interesting about that, too, aside from it being, giving a clue as to why you might want to limit the number of beds, but it's also the same type of prosecutorial discretion. It's a little bit, of a blunter instrument in terms of how you're making your, what constitutes discretion. But it's the same functionally equivalent to the prosecutorial discretion that worked, that brought us DACA. Right? And I mean, it's the same idea. We either have the capacity to do this, or we don't have the capacity to do this. And, in the case of DACA, people were screaming with their hair on fire as if it was like some type of dereliction of duty. So, I mean, the same thing goes on in terms of this. It just, from a strategic standpoint and wanting to have less of it, you give them less capacity to hold people.
Right, and all it does is really force them to make smarter choices. So another client was detained in October, and she was breastfeeding a baby at the time, not literally at the time she was arrested, but her baby was at home, and she was begging the officers, you have to let me go home. I've got this baby who's in the temporary care of my older children. And they said, no, we have to detain you. And I made requests with ICE to let her out on an order of supervision, which they're allowed to do, and they refused until she was at her 90-day review. And suddenly they decided to let her out, even though there were no changed circumstances at all between October and January. So they just sort of randomly detained this lady and randomly decided to let her out, which shows, again, how arbitrary the whole thing is, that a person can be sort of detained and then let go, and it just shows that it's all very meaningless. And again, if they had a cap, a stronger cap, they would be forced to look at somebody like that and say, look, we can't have her taking up space when we could have, drug dealers or human traffickers coming along. So, the whole thing is the more bed space you give them, they will find a way to fill it. And that whole system is really terribly broken on so many levels. But, people need to understand that they're out there talking right now about we need the bed space because we, MS-13, whatever the hell they're, whatever scary term they're throwing around. And what's actually happening is single mothers of 6, including a 3-month-old baby, are getting, scooped up and detained for no reason because they can and because they have the bed space. And so, don't let your Fox News viewing family members get away with, arguing that this is somehow going to
inhibit the ability to keep dangerous people off the ground. Yeah. All right, Ron Reagan, thanks so much. I appreciate it. Very, very interesting. And
bye.
Folks, that's it for our phone calls today. Sorry about that. We got, obviously, as always, have over 20 people on the line. People have been hanging on for almost 90 minutes. I'm going to do 10 more IMs, and then we got to get going. Turn up Bega. Sam, what is the persuasive argument against people who say raising marginal tax rate won't matter much because the effective tax rate for the 1% never got above 43% or so, even when the marginal tax rate was at 90% or higher? Well, that was built into the cake. That effective tax rate was there ostensibly because ostensibly it was at 43% as an effective tax rate, and I'm not sure about that, but I know definitely the idea of loopholes and whatnot was problematic. We can make the tax rate land wherever we want it to. It's really just a matter of political will. These loopholes are in there because they're designed to be in there. but the marginal rate is it's definitely lower than 43% at this point. That's for sure. So, Jair Bolsonaro pneumonia. Hello, MR crew. I'm contacting you to declare myself the new acting president of Brazil. I'm requesting international recognition, solidarity, and material support from U.S. comrades John McCain's brain tumor and Charlie Kirk's blood clot.
Bolsonaro.
Lula Libre.
Lula Libre.
Hey, Jonathan Armstead, Sam, on the inauguration show, you started a story about how you interviewed with Saturday Night Live to direct their short films. You got interrupted and didn't get to finish. What happened there? I like your stories about politics of the industry, and also think this would have been cool since you dig Albert Brooks. That's exactly why I was so excited to do it. And I cannot remember for the life of me what I pitched. But I do remember the guy saying to me, would a 12-year-old get that? And I was like, I don't think so. And he's like, yeah, well, that's why it wouldn't work. I'm like, excuse me? He said, well, you got to make it, you know.
I want to do cultural criticism and serious
You got to make it funny for a 12-year-old. And I was like, I don't know how to do that. I'm an adult.
I thought it was like Mr.
Like a situationist joke.
Mr. Lauren
No,
Michaels.
it wasn't.
Mr. Michaels wears lavender flavored cologne.
It wasn't that. It wasn't that sophisticated of a. You know, it's a short film.
Like a 16-year-old could get it.
Yeah.
Wow.
I think a 16-year-old could have gotten it. I mean, I wasn't. I was it was my mid to late 20s. I mean, I wasn't. You know, it was his way of saying, you're too heady. I'm like,
and then Foucault comes in,
exactly.
and then it's all revealed.
But I did get a little offended. I was like, are you serious? Yeah. Job B. But if you watch Saturday Night Live for any extended period of time, you watch the full 90 minutes and you watch over the course of like 6 months, and you have that in the back of your head, all of a sudden it becomes a lot more understandable. How could they do this?
That's when I like Saturday Night Live the most. I was watching like the best ofs and I loved it.
I mean,
I was gonna say, if you go back to like Eddie Murphy or Dan Aykroyd, like I think that was not 12-year-olds were not copping that.
Look, they're copping Chris Farley. Listen, Chris Farley in a small jacket.
Here's
they probably got that.
Yeah, but here's the
that's
thing.
pretty awesome though.
Here's the thing about 12-year-olds.
12-year-olds are also smarter than people give them credit for.
First of all, they're smarter than people give them credit for, but they also get, and I think this is across the board, they get when things are supposed to be funny. Right. Like they don't necessarily get all the references. You can listen to you go back, you listen to, like some Lenny Bruce stuff or, anybody in the 60s who was really good. There are cultural references you don't get, but you get why they're funny, like who they're supposed to be. And that's what I think I perceive like 12-year-olds looking at comedy. Half the time, like you watch something you thought was funny when you're 12, you realize like, I totally got the joke wrong.
When Derrida comes in, you'll laugh by implication. It's a joke about text reading.
Next year, Super Tuesday is the California primary in March. Yes, kind of favors Harris. Indeed. MR member, will Majority Report end like Words Matter podcast? I can see it now. Sam's tried to return to the show like nothing has changed after working for the Bloomberg 2020 campaign. To face the wrath of Michael, Jamie, and Matt does not go well. Sam denies being paid to avoid sharing a payday. JJ Cool, I watched an interview with Juan Guaido on Al Jazeera this morning. He asked a question about international support. He started his response with a green saying, and the people. I'm not sure I follow. Goldie Taylor, if you did research like a, thank you. It's the largest historically black, your guest taught at North Carolina A&T University. It's the largest historically black university in the country, meaning they teach more than ag and tech there. Yes, I did know that. I did not know that it was an alma mater of Jesse Jackson, senior and junior, and challenger Austin Ronald McNair. So more black erasure? No, I knew it was. Historically black university. It's right in the description of the book. Somebody should clip that You could not make F News happier. Fox News happier? I don't know what that is. Oh. The Disco Stew. One thing that's been revealing about the whole Ilhan Omar debacle is the consistency of those in the media labeling her tweet anti-Semitic. Did you notice there's been no racially tinged or controversial? It speaks volumes that there's no hesitancy to call something anti-Semitic, but at the same time they won't dare call anything racist. Yes, indeed. Well, because there's a full-on push to portray what she's doing as anti-Semitic, as opposed to being like, broadly based, I think, sort of accurate and inartfully communicated.
But that's the tell. Look, people could go to her behind the scenes and say, here's the problem with that tweet from a framing perspective, which is totally valid. But having a big pile-on, and now you get to the point where Steve Scalise has the temerity to tweet out that, like, oh, I'm so glad David Duke without the baggage is glad that they've condemned this hateful rhetoric. And also, you know, David Rothkopf, of all people, who's a very mainstream foreign policy guy and, you know, Jewish background, was like, yeah, it wasn't good phrasing, but this is also a major freak out because this is changing.
Right.
And they're trying to fight back as intensely as they can.
That's exactly what it is. This is an argument I used to have with Indy Mike in those email exchanges. And I was telling him, like, look, dude, the fact of the matter is that people like you who support the right in Israel, and this was five years ago, you know, when there was still sort of like almost making that distinction still had some, at least fumes of relevance, right? Like, I mean, less and less so. Does that distinction mean anything? I understand there's a left, and I understand there's an anti-war, and I understand there's social justice in Israel, but in terms of just sheer power and numbers, its ability is at as low of an ebb as it's ever been. But the failure of American Jewry to influence the debate in pushing Israel away from the right is going to lead, I think, to its isolation, because the Democratic Party in 5, 10 years, 15, is not going to be supportive of Israel as a matter of policy. It would be impossible based upon, you know, it's irrational to think that you could force the Democratic Party to maintain support for a government that is doing this to a huge segment of the people who live in their country. And the fact is that when the Democrats, when the support for Israel is diminished as a plank in the Democratic Party, Israel is going to become increasingly isolated. And that is going to be a problem for that country.
Well, that being said, I mean, hopefully, but I think that they've already made this is the reason that Israel's building tighter relations with China, with Russia, with far-right parties and governments like the one in Hungary that is an overt neo-fascist government. And clearly the Republican Party has no problem with apartheid and, you know, toxic identity politics, which is really, frankly, what it is. So I think they've been making that calculation for quite some time. This argument happened in Israel a long time ago. People like Olmert and Ehud Barak said liberals in the United States and the traditional Jewish constituencies are not going to like this. And they meant like a pragmatic, not moral argument. And they lost. And the forces that are winning are like, why don't we just align with global far-right governments?
There you go. All right, 4 more of these. Street legal. Not one single human being was put on Earth in order to punch a clock. Not one. Elon Cucks. Sam needs to ask Samir if he thinks working 80 to 90 hours a week is fair. There's more than enough money to go around to not require everyone to do meaningless jobs. Indeed.
I agree. I just want to say really quick. I do think there's some people with immigrant experience and mentality who just find that frame offensive because of, frankly, how much they're putting in. I think that's why it's sympathy with the call. It's nothing about the substance. Nothing about the substance.
I just think that
I think that's why that.
I think he was in agreement with us in terms of.
He's totally in agreement with us. It's just that term caught his attention.
Schmidt still probably stinging from that exchange with Nicole Wallace on our MSNBC show. She was very aggressive, calling him out. He was very pissed. And the number and dollar amount taken by cheaters of social network can't compare to the amount of damage and funds stolen by 1% who cheat the system. Lots of us white people have unconscious, unaware racism. As we become more aware of it, we can change. That's growth. Apathetic steamroller. I'd love to see the Dems start talking about homelessness. According to HUD employee 2012, the cost to effectively end homelessness in the U.S. is only $20 billion a year. Scott Walker, Texas. Samir sounds like he's just unhappy with the wording like that because it makes it easier for. Yeah, I think that's what it was. But the wording turns out not to be the case. The Chris Lapaco will be the final IM of the day. Talk about Candace Owens. See you tomorrow.
It might take all the strength I got to get to where I want, but I know somehow I'm gonna get there. I wasn't looking when I just got caught between the truth and the light bar, but finding out won't make me feel any better. Yeah, I know the clock is ticking, but the meds are gonna kick in, and my pilot light shining bright. I guess somewhere the choice was made for the option where you don't get paid, for the rope that bends before it finally breaks you. I guess somehow I lost my drive between the 101 and the 5. Do you know how far the detour takes you? Yeah, I know the clock is ticking, but the meds are